Hey everybody, super excited to be back, and I'm back with Ron Bodkin, who has been in the tech industry for a number of years, got a lot of experience, and bringing that experience into the Web3 world. Not only any kind of experience, but real machine learning experience to a decentralized environment. So really happy to exchange views and super excited to have Ron here. Hey Ron.
Hey, Stefan, super excited to be here. It's great
Yeah.
to be talking a little bit about what we're doing at ChainML. And, as you alluded, I've been doing work in machine learning for the last 15 years. And, I've been an entrepreneur a number of times in my career, and just awesome to be back starting a company again and building something cool.
Yeah, you've been working in sort of particularly in the cloud space with companies like Quantcast, Google Cloud, etc. Right, and so share with us how your view is, having worked with maybe such big institutions and now sort of on your own and in a new startup on Web3, from this sort of centralized cloud environment to this Web3 decentralized world.
Yeah, it's certainly I've seen, the importance of having large scale computing and optimized resources in the machine learning space. As you know, like at
Yeah,
Quantcast, 15 years ago, we had to build everything from scratch, building from our own data centers
yeah,
and optimize the full stack. And, then went on to think big analytics. We were helping enterprises execute machine learning. And it was a mix between on-premise and public cloud. We did a lot of work with Amazon Web Services early on, and continued even at Google Cloud, and I was in the CTO office focusing on AI. And so I guess what I'd say is, we think that it's really important to have the right kind of execution environment for efficiency and scale, but there's so much opportunity in our view around creating real open standards to let you scale the compute to do machine learning. And I think that often is under considered is of course, machine learning relies on a ton of data. The amount of data that's used for training, even the amount of data that's used at runtime to execute the models, the amount of data that's required to describe the models. So I think a lot of times in the Web3 space, people underappreciate that scale of data and the importance of getting data right as well as computation, which is why we don't think that executing machine learning on a blockchain is going to work, whether it be using smart contract language to do the execution, or in fact store all the data required to do the execution, right? So we think you really have to build a kind of open cloud that's interoperable, that doesn't rely on centralized proprietary architectures. So we think that's the big opportunity here.
interesting. Because actually, before I go in, and usually I forget these because I get so ingrained right away into the conversation. But one of the things I like to ask everybody is there a book that you've read recently that really stood out or has shaped you in the past, a book that you read a long time ago that you felt really, that's a book that I remember, and maybe also for the audience, just to give them a view of what they could be reading and or listening to, because nowadays I don't think we read anymore. We get audiobooks and we listen to them, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been reading a lot. I mean, a good book that I read, actually a seminal book, was a book Surveillance Capitalism, which I thought was really good discussion of like some of the challenges in the current ecosystem. There's been a number of good books on the topic, but I thought that one had some really interesting insights, as I was thinking about like what are some of the challenges and risks in getting it wrong with machine learning. And I think that book encapsulated a lot of what was emerging as challenges. So that's one that jumps to mind. There's a number of great books though.
Interesting. Yeah, because I mean, anyway, it's yeah. I mean, surveillance capitalism. It's like you could construe that in so many different ways, right? And with CBDCs coming out now, everybody's sort of really worried of the 1984 George Orwell picture, where state really has a lot of control or influence in how we spend our money, how we direct our money. In the US, fortunately, 70% of GDP is still consumer power, right? So it's in the consumer's hand. However, if you go across to Europe, government spending is driving a lot of the economies over there. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. I mean, I think you have to worry about, surveillance of all kinds,
yeah,
government surveillance, surveillance dictatorship is quite
yeah,
ominous and
yeah,
disturbing. But, I think that the risk with the surveillance capitalism is you get these increasingly powerful technology firms that are controlling so much, like
yeah,
controlling the data,
yeah,
controlling the resources and locking up the talent.
yeah,
And, increasingly, AI and machine learning is being built by and delivered by a small number of powerful companies, and it's being used to optimize for their purposes, right? Which
yeah,
is surveillance to drive a profit, right? Like
yeah,
I always think about it this way: if someone had told me 20 years ago that we would have these amazing AI assistants in our homes and we could talk to them and they would meet our needs, I'd be like, that's cool. That's kind of what I would hope to have happen. And then say, oh, but the way they work is big companies deploy them and listen to you, and their goal is really to sell you products or advertise. You don't choose, you don't pay for them directly as a subscription, but they're being installed by big, powerful monopolies, to serve their own interests. You'd be like, well, that's kind of creepy. How did we end up there? And there we are.
There's a really good blog post actually out there that sort of describes winner takes all, right? And it does analogy to a lot of sports, right? Where you look at the Olympics, if the winner, you always remember the winner, but you never remember the second and the third place. And the similar thing happens in business. If there's an RFP out for a company to go and win, if the company wins that proposal, they win all of the budget. It's not broken down, so there's no second or third prize even, right? There's just one prize, and that goes all to the winner. And that then ultimately allows them to spend more money in marketing, spend more money in different, recruiting talent. And then ultimately also a second company or third company, oh, you're already working with them? I'll work with you as well. So you've got a use case that leads to your advantage, which then leads to that aggregation of power that you mentioned earlier, and then ultimately more data as well, right?
It's true. Although,
Yeah,
the hopeful thing I would say is we've seen the power of open source has
yeah,
been a real neutralizer, right?
yeah,
People thought that Microsoft was going to take over all the servers on the internet,
yeah,
back in the 1990s, and then Linux came along and absolutely won out, right?
yeah,
And so I think the beautiful thing about Web3 is that it gives, way that communities can fight back and
yeah,
fund successful standards that meet the needs of not just, a capitalist that controls it, but users and creators, right? And in the same way, you think about what can be done with machine learning, right? We think about Web3 social and looking forward to the metaverse and say,
yeah,
wouldn't it be nice if you could have more choice over your experience and what is recommended to you and what gets filtered out as spam or inappropriate content, and a choice of child controls that your teenagers, you could decide with the right granularity what your teenagers should and shouldn't be doing.
yeah,
These are things that I think are huge opportunities. But the dynamic of Web 2, where you have the moats and this winner take all dynamic, you're right, Stefan. Is like, now what's the incentive
yeah.
providing that choice? Right now it's like we're going to maintain our network, and all too often the incentive is to allow it to become more divisive, to become more damaging and more addictive, right? And people aren't given the choice anymore.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely are reducing the amount of choice that we get, right? And to me, one of the core things is just providing alternatives, right? Providing choice to everybody. And the business models, I think you pointed out one thing that really stands out to me is open source, right? The open source nature and the developer community contributing to this open source software framework, right, has been a phenomenal movement and a significant change that has not only led to new operating systems, e.g., Linux versus a Microsoft, but has also enabled a lot of the cloud computing capabilities, right? Has enabled mobility, app development, blockchain, crypto development, etc., right? And so that's been a phenomenal power of change and enabling a lot more innovation to happen from multiple different institutions. You do not need to be so big anymore to innovate on a new technology. But it's different in data, right? I mean, in data, it's so hard to aggregate the volumes of data that you have. Tesla in the car business, Google in the search business, Amazon in the commerce business, right? And Microsoft in their gaming business, right? All of this data that they're aggregating. How do we sort of disseminate the data, or how do we get to a point where we're slowly chipping away at their data aggregation capabilities, or yeah, their routes to aggregation. Let's say that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of factors here. One is I think that long term, the
Yeah,
opportunity to give real agency and control for users and DAOs to really make good decisions and represent what's a good use of their data, right? I mean, you would see things like previously as at the Vector Institute, Canada's leading AI research institute, and we were working with
yeah,
the health system
yeah,
around how do you allow use of health data to drive beneficial research, and
yeah,
it was so hard to get approval and buy-in to even new techniques that preserve privacy to doing machine learning, right? It's just, I think a big factor is allowing people to let their data be used in an effective way, and so DAOs and representation, I think in Web3 can long term allow for people to really contribute their data to meaningful projects they care about. There will be some ways that people can sell their data and make some money, but I think that narrative that the answer is to pay people for their data, I'm a little skeptical about that being
okay,
long-term answer. I think people are more open to contributing their data to something that they connect with and they believe has purpose and meaning. And the other thing is there's also in the Web3 space, there's a lot more transparency, a lot more public data, right? I think we're going to get to the right balance. I think, maybe sometimes there's a little too much public data, but the presence of so much data that's visible on a blockchain creates a lot of value that can be used in training machine learning models, right? You can analyze transaction history and look to price things in DeFi, or address risk, or be able to collect social data and use it to identify spam or phishing or whatnot. So, in a sense, Web3 is a space that leans more towards transparency and making some amount of data available, which is a good thing. But, there's no simple answer here, right? There's always going to be this trade-off of privacy and control and
yeah,
value.
yeah.
But the more we can create trustworthy entities and transparency that people can feel confident, the more there'll be willingness to share data.
Yeah, because I mean, there's certain models that have already evolved in crypto land, I'd say, right? I look at particularly consumer-facing models where actually that people are rewarded for sharing their data. Steppen, I look at Sweatcoin. The more I sweat, the more coins I earn. But ultimately, I'm sharing that data associated with my sweat, right? Am I walking? Am I running? Am I swimming? What are all my activities? How do they accumulate points, which then get converted into a currency, which then get distributed to me? So I'm sharing my data and getting a reward associated with that. And then I can use that coin to participate in games, buy NFTs, or even buy physical real world products, right? At a sort of discount. Those are interesting experiments, and to a certain extent they seem to be getting a lot of traction and getting a lot of new users into crypto land.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's very much follows that concept that you can use token incentives
Yep.
to really reward early adopters, and then there's more value for those early adopters to join, and which is some of it's about incentivizing them to contribute data, but a lot of it's about building the network or the community, right? Like, you can clearly see where Stefan, Sweatcoin, companies like that, or protocols like that, can create long-term value in terms of providing useful data for people that are developing great health and fitness products, right? So that can be a three-sided marketplace. But I think it's also something where that the users are getting a delightful experience. They're
Yeah.
enjoying those interactions, right? Like, I think that's way more appealing than an app that's just like paying you for data, but you don't enjoy using the app, it doesn't
Yeah.
doing anything else for you. It's just a small amount of money that comes into your pocket, because that doesn't scale very well. It's like when it's small, it's easy to reward people with meaningful. Like people are making a lot of money at first on Stefan, but now it's a big community. The value is much more, and you're intrinsically motivated to compete and to get fitness and to go out and take steps every day, rather than that you're making a lot of money.
Yeah.
Right now that it's
Yeah.
reached a level of scale.
Yeah. No, I think, one thing I want to sort of maybe switch topic a bit, but ultimately a lot of this results out of new data being fed into the system, right? And with your experience in AI and your background in that area, how have you seen AI evolved over the last couple of years? Maybe actually decade. We've had AI for a bit, but never, I think, to the magnitude as we have it today.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of exciting developments in
Yeah.
AI in the last 10 years. It's been the case that we had the use of machine learning was just beginning to get some traction. We had a few trends come together. One was the use of GPUs
Yeah.
suddenly allowed you to make much faster progress in training deep learning models that really started to get people excited. It went basically in a matter of 1 year. It went from something that wasn't being widely used to the dominant technique for computer vision. There was a contest, ImageNet, and suddenly 1 year, a team from University of Toronto entered and beat everybody, like 1/3 the error rate of everybody else with this new technique. And then within 2 years, everyone was using deep learning, right? Which is basically using a neural network
Yep.
to be able to train models. And the same thing has happened in other fields. It's happened with speech recognition and language translation. And, the most recent development, there's been a few developments along the way as it scaled. There's been this idea of transformers, which have resulted in these amazing language models like GPT-3, that have become really powerful, right? Much better able to produce realistic text, to have useful conversations. They've created a lot of excitement, right? And similar technique has actually resulted in Dolly and Stable Diffusion. Most recently, is really exciting image generators, right? Give them, in fact, it's a hybrid, right? It's trained on text on the internet and images, and you tell it what you want it to draw, and it draws you a few interesting renditions of whatever you wanted to see. Just like language models like GPT-3 can write text to answer your questions or complete a story or whatnot. So there's been a tremendous advance, right? Tremendous increase in sophistication in the software techniques, the amount of data that's used, the resources that are being used, and so we're having rapid advances. And this concept of foundation models has come out, where it's like you have a specific technique, a model that can be used for a wide variety of tasks, rather than the more traditional approaches. I need to build a machine learning model that does one thing really well.
Yeah. But generally, machine learning is really you're training the machine to basically learn one thing and get really good at it, right? And to me, the advantage of that, I mean, and there are a lot of complexities, right? So I looked, I mean, if you look at how the automotive industry, the self-driving car industry has evolved, and it started off two technologies. One is the one that Tesla's using, which is image recognition, right? AI, and we'll teach all the different images. We'll capture so many different images. We'll teach it how to react in which different situation based on which image, and be able to store that. And then there's the LiDAR technology, which is sensor based, right? So it's trying to sense all the movements and all the different signs around it and then react associated with that. And to me, like you mentioned, the progress in GPUs has got an interesting impact in the side of that Tesla has chosen to go with its image recognition, because I can actually now store much more data at a cheaper cost. I can process a lot more data faster and at a cheaper cost. And so to me, it's interesting, yeah, how that works. And to have that foresight just shows how difficult it is in choices you make that have a significant outcome, not today, but the choice you make today has such an impact in maybe a couple of years' time. And you have to make bets on how industries are going to evolve, right? And I think
Yeah, no, that connected vehicles, autonomous vehicles, it's a huge industry, right?
yeah,
And similar techniques, whether you're using LiDAR or computer vision just on light data, right,
yeah,
are being applied. And, you have massive amount of labeling of data that's required and lots of large scale simulation to be able to, evaluate safety, create a lot of simulated scenarios to assess safety. But it's still a very hard problem because there's such a long tail. So many weird things can happen in the real world. And
yeah.
so getting to confidence, and partly too because we have so much of a higher bar of what we expect from a new system than the current system.
Yeah.
If you could demonstrate that autonomous vehicles were half as likely to get into accidents and half as likely to kill people, that should be a no-brainer. But I think you would never see approval of something that was only half as likely. I think it has to be at least 10 times safer in order to get approval, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's obviously always the challenge, and I think regulatory hurdles, given a change and uncertainty, the risk is always going to favor, given that risk, the decision is always going to favor not going down that path, mainly just because of the exposure that it could bring with it, right? But I do think that we need, from a regulatory standpoint, we need sometimes a bigger leap in faith in order to progress as a society and to provide hope and opportunity to the next generation that's coming along.
Yeah, I definitely think that's where, it's so much more powerful to have market forces
Yep.
that reward innovation and new choices. That's what I think is exciting about Web3 is it's,
Yep.
again, creating a platform for innovation and letting users and creators vote with their feet and pick the things that are really working for them, right?
Yep.
So that you're not stuck with, the confusing roadmaps and the long launch cycles and the narrow focus of, companies that are protecting a massive advertising monopoly or, some other kind of monopoly, and suddenly you've got, new innovators coming in and trying things that are really delightful products,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So I think we're not going to see a lot of success waiting for government to figure out how to regulate this stuff. Instead, we need to figure out how to build these DAOs, how to build great open source, how to really return power to users and creators so they can pick the things that are going to really serve their needs.
And I think and exactly I mean, with your background, right? You've done a lot of writing around ethics, around AI, in terms of how technology is going to impact society. Sort of, yeah. What are your real concerns in the future around? I mean, you've talked about the centralization or the aggregation of a lot of data within a few entities. What are some of the other concerns that you have on that front?
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally, it's really important that we keep some level of there continues to be feedback around is the way that machine learning and AI is rolling out in products really meeting the needs and the interests of users and creators and society more generally, right? I worry a lot about if as you automate processes, you allow companies to use AI to increasingly create problems, and then they have big companies have very little incentive to investigate and question the negative repercussions of their actions, right? And maybe an unintended consequence of whistleblowers, like Frances Haugen with Meta, is that big companies like them will be less inclined to even do research and analyze what's going wrong. But the problem is these systems are incredibly secretive. Like it's basically, I spent time in the Global Partnership on AI, working with their social media working group, and in that group, the big challenge is there's no good way for outsiders to independently study and assess the impact of what's going on. It's not so much that everything is a problem, right? You can always spin up a story of this is an issue, that is an issue, but to have any level of confidence, you need to have a way of studying and saying, is this something that's warranted? Is this a problem? How big a problem is it, right? If you're creating an externality, just like, we have to be able to study if pollution is creating problems and be able to decide what a policy response is. So, I think a level of transparency, a level of ability for vetted researchers to be able to look at what's going wrong could go a long way, and really calibrating what are the challenges. But I still prefer that we try to drive innovation and get out of a world where we're regulating a few powerful monopolists that control so much of society. Yeah. I just have a hard time seeing the latter as like a positive direction for the long term.
And it's so funny, right? I remember when Facebook and Twitter both started, they had very open networks. When they first launched, they had all their APIs public. You could query anything. You could build on top of their community. That's how they helped grow their ecosystem, was leveraging the community who could build on top of it. And now it's exactly the opposite. They've gone shut down, super secretive, and very contrary to the open source community, which is really write my code, open source it, publish it. And even some of the bigger companies that are trying to foster bigger change at a grander scale are even open sourcing proprietary technologies, whereas others are shut down. Why is that? Is that because of regulatory requirements? Is that because of abuse that has happened? Is that because of, know?
No, you're completely right about the direction. You went from building these platforms that were encouraging developers. I think the analysis, Chris Dixon's argument of companies go from attractive to extractive, right? That early on they're trying to build their platform, they market to developers, they make it enticing. At some point, the dial switches, and they're like, how do we extract as much value from the community we've captured as possible, right? You go from Facebook promoting the use of their APIs to putting their partners out of business, suing, Power Ventures who built an alternative UI on top of social media, right? Basically, there's this tendency, right, to switch that, and of course, you'll always have an argument, right? And they're not wrong arguments. Like there's privacy concerns, and there's a level of quality, and if you allow enough openness, it allows the Cambridge Analyticas of the world to get access to data and exploit users, and there are legitimate things to think about. It's not like there's unfettered access to all the data and allowing anyone to interoperate doesn't have problems. It has real challenges, right? But yeah, I think getting to an ethos where you build where there's more ability to trust the long-term direction of the ecosystem, that's a huge attraction again of an open source space where you have more confidence in the long-term behavior, whereas you unfortunately could have a lot of confidence in long-term behavior of massive corporation that they will become extractive, and they're going to start to optimize for two things. One is profit, and two is minimizing risk, right?
There's definitely a role between founder-led companies and sort of professional management-led companies. And there's also a transition that always takes place, right? And it's always very challenging because ultimately there's a culture and a philosophy that helped get a company to a certain point with the founder, maybe in some cases, sort of really behind a new vision and mission and culture versus a new management that comes in. Or even when you go public, right? The expectations on what you have may actually influence the culture that you have and the vision, and the path to pursue that vision changes. But either way, one of the things that I feel always interesting, there's always a new set of technology coming around the corner. There's always going to be something new. And we spent a lot of our time, we launched trueflation.com, so we're now aggregating a lot of data. And I think partially that's how we started getting deeper and deeper involved in our relationship, where how could we leverage the data that we track to leverage and use that for AI, right? And for us, we're tracking 18 million items. We go back 10 years and all the way to 2010, and we capture that data on a day-to-day basis, right? How I mean, for us, storage is a big issue, right? Scalability in terms of being able to process that data is equally an issue. And then ultimately, there's a way to manage that data and then be able to share it to the decentralized community, allow them to work with it, allow us to monetize that. Where, in your experience, across Web3, do we have the biggest problem? Is it really going to be on the storage side? Is it going to be on the management side? Is it all going to be on scalability in terms of being able to process that on a decentralized network in a decentralized database?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the processing the data in a decentralized way. So to be able to access it in real time, to be able to build high value models on top, right? So like, take all this detailed inflation data and latest updates, then to be able to start to do predictive models of where is it going, and what's the volatility or the range, right? Like, just as important to know like how much confidence you have and how big a variation might it be, for example, right? And that could translate into not just a global forecast but a regional forecast, right? It matters a lot for you if you're planning production in your specific area, if you're planning hedging, like making practical decisions. Historical data can let you build really effective models to make the most efficient choices, right? So I think doing that requires you to take in all this recent data and then to be able to compute on top of it and then return the result. And again, like doing that on top of inside a blockchain, to storing all the data in a blockchain is a non-starter, but doing it in a way that you can be tamper proof and you can have confidence that it's being done accurately is incredibly important.
Yeah, interesting, because I mean, for us, one surprise was the fact that we were approached from a lot of traditional finance companies about our data. And their request was they liked the fact that it was always documented and logged on chain, so they know it couldn't be changed, and they were getting an accurate reflection of that data. Number two is they all wanted to take it off, to your comment right at the beginning of our conversation, which was you can't do everything on chain in a decentralized environment with such big data. And so they want to take it off chain and process a lot and run it through their own proprietary algorithms to then do the predictive elements associated with that. Do you see a time where Web3 will be able to have that compute on chain to be able to process those?
Yeah, so we don't think it's going to be on chain. I think that there's a lot of room to have confidence and tamper proofing and scale and transparency without having everything be on chain. Just like decentralized storage systems like IPFS let you have confidence about having data that's stored in a decentralized way or an Arweave, right? Rather than having to have it either stored in a blockchain or in a traditional centralized cloud storage environment, right? So I think the same thing around how do you build sophisticated computation. You can have more transparency into the models that are run and how they're run, but it's not going to be running on a blockchain. And we don't believe that any approach anyone has yet suggested is going to allow that. But, it's like, it's going to require a spectrum of options, right? So you can still have security, transparency, censorship resistance without having it be as high overhead and as high security as doing things on a blockchain is.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think it's largely just, again, having it on chain in terms of storage wise, and then taking the processing off chain, and then being able to have the flexibility in playing around with it and using it, because ultimately it is about how you use the data. So having data, I remember at the beginning, we got all this data. It's like, how clean is it? Have you worked it? Have you structured it? It's like, oh no, but we can't give it away. We're just going to sit on it and we're just not going to do anything with it. It's like, but then it gets stale, it gets old, it's like, is it relevant anymore? And things like that. So it was interesting. But one of the companies I used to work in was in Energy Box. We founded the ability to track the pulse of electrical devices connected to a socket. And based on that, we could then, based on the frequency of the electric waves, we could identify the type of device. Was it a big refrigerator? Was it a light bulb? Was it a computer? What was it? So based on pulses, we could see that. And then we could see changes in patterns, which would likely mean that there might be an error occurring, or the engine was getting tired, or it was overheating, or whatever it might be. And so that was an interesting use of, but it took us so long to convince entities and enterprise to understand that. And in my view, there's the big tech companies that have grown out of data and using data to create a competitive advantage. And then there's the sort of traditional enterprise that have always sort of tried to use data and learn from data, but have never really managed to execute down that path, or taken long decision times and cycles to agree on how to pursue that path. How do you see the enterprise world adopting more blockchain capabilities in terms of entering into their processing capability associated with data? Because it's not a currency, it doesn't come conflict with CFOs, but it's really data, and it's a way to aggregate everything and move it around and share it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're going to see it's technology that's going to get a lot of adoption in the enterprise. It's already happening. You're seeing consumer brands adopting NFTs as an example, right? And you're seeing more scenarios where DeFi rails can dramatically improve the efficiency of financial processing. I think that's going to continue to accelerate. So I think over time it's going to keep seeping into enterprise, and we'll get that kind of adoption. So I think you're right that just like it's taken longer for more traditional machine learning and analytics to make its way into the mainstream and the enterprise versus Web2 natives that were built that way from the ground up. I think Web3 natives are going to forge the way here and really demonstrate how you can create value, right? Like your example of a Stefan or Sweatcoin that are able to acquire interesting data much faster with tokenomics than a traditional effort to build a network, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunity here for sure.
Yeah, one thing, how do you view governments, right? I mean, governments actually are a big aggregator of all sorts of personal data, privacy data, health data, etc. How do you view their role and their usage and adoption of AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think governments are definitely, at varying stages. There's a few early adopters, a few governments like, Taiwan, Singapore, Estonia that are very progressive, in AI and or blockchain adoption, right? That are doing creative things and setting some nice examples. And I think, it was interesting. Like I had a chance to be involved working with state and local governments during the and provincial governments as well, and during the COVID pandemic. And you could see that it was very hard. That they didn't have the kind of data infrastructure, and it was very hard to move quickly and to make decisions, even when there was a critical crisis, right? So I think governments have tended to lack a lot of the funding to be able to put innovative digital services and the necessary data and machine learning on top. And I think there's rightly concern around surveillance and privacy and proper use of data, and that slows down decisions, and also making big bold decisions. Like it was hard enough to make the big decisions in the middle of a crisis like a pandemic, but in normal times it's incredibly hard in a democracy to make sweeping decisions, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's in a democracy, it gets even harder, right? And especially when you come to election times, people are nervous about what the outcomes are going to be, and what are the ethics involved around that, right? One thing that you mentioned Toronto and the company that you used to work, Vector. You mentioned the name, right? I was just on with one of our advisors, who's working at Berkeley, with Berkeley, the accelerator program, out of the California Berkeley blockchain. And one of the things that he mentioned was vector search as a new technology for AI. And I never heard of vector search, so it was the first time I heard about that. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you can explain to me what that is. And I thought it was a company, but it was actually a technology that a lot of different companies use, particularly in the SaaS world.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I know one of the techniques there's being used a lot is doing searches in embedding space. Sort of deep learning model. You can characterize things like a piece of content with a high dimensional vector, right? And so to come up with recommendations, you tend to find like what are a bunch of nearby items in
Yeah.
that vector space that give you a list of candidates of things that are promising to say, now let's run a more detailed analysis on these 100,000 items and decide which ones are the top ones to rank. So that kind of search and embedding space is certainly one type of search. But I don't know if that's what you're intending in terms of vector search, but that's certainly one type that I'm familiar with.
Okay. Yeah, no, interesting. I mean, it's sort of one of the things that, again, coming back to the data, I mean, we're ultimately trying to bring economic data on chain and make that available to developers, largely smart contract developers, as we believe that most of the world will be tokenized, and a lot of the economic assets and data that we have are going to be converted into a token in some form or fashion. And for that, I need economic data. And as we go down that path, how do we identify what correlations are between specific elements? And then how do we define that? And so that's one thing that we've been looking at. And so, yeah. But in your view, right, sort of when you think of data, what comes to mind first? Do you think of financial data, health, identity? What sort of comes to mind out of just curiosity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it always is going to depend on the application and the use case, right? There's definitely, in DeFi, there's a lot of rich data, a lot of valuable financial data. But then you look at things like credit risk scoring and you start saying, well, there's complementary data that's
Yeah,
not financial, that's
yeah,
incredibly important too, right?
yeah,
And, there's companies, we're talking to companies in the digital health space. And obviously it's, very different data sets again, or in Web3 social around postings and recommendations and interactions. So, the data varies a lot depending on, what you're working on.
I just really feel super exciting space that you're in. I it's just how and lots of insights that you have and deep experience, Ron, and super excited to have you on. And I think it's a really super exciting time to be alive, right? I mean, in AI, in Web3, all these new innovations that are happening in concurrence. And how can people follow you and learn about your company, what you're doing? Where can they follow you on Twitter? What's the best way to follow you and find out more about ChainML?
Yeah, definitely exciting times. Yeah, so I'm at Ron Bodkin on
Yeah.
Twitter, and then we're at ChainML _ on Twitter. So
Okay.
both great places to follow and track. Right, right now we're pretty heads down building towards our MVP, but as we make progress into early next year, we plan to be talking a lot more about the details of what we're working on and how we're making Web3 really able to take advantage of AI and machine learning. Stefan, it's been great having a chance to be here tonight.
Thank you. Super good. And there's so much data on the blockchains. So looking forward to seeing the progress. Thanks a lot, Ron. Thanks for your time and appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.